In June 1812, Napoleon led the largest army in European history into Russia. 6 months later, 92% of those soldiers were dead. What happened in those 6 months was not just a military disaster, it was a masterclass in how the most powerful man in the world destroyed himself through a single decision. As you consider the magnitude of this defeat, ask yourself, what could have driven Napoleon to launch such a catastrophic invasion, with 685,000 soldiers, the largest army ever assembled in European history, including 200,000 cavalrymen and 1,000 artillery pieces? Before the invasion, Napoleon had been expanding his empire, conquering much of Europe, and in 1807, he signed the Treaty of Tilsit with Russia, making them allies, but by 1810, he had begun to suspect that Russia was secretly negotiating with Britain, and on December 31, 1810, Tsar Alexander I of Russia issued a decree banning the importation of French goods, which led to a significant decline in French trade and influenced Napoleon's decision to invade. In the years leading up to the invasion, Napoleon had also been dealing with the Spanish War, which had been draining his resources since 1808, and the disastrous Walcheren campaign in 1809, which had cost him 20,000 men, and you might wonder, how did these previous military campaigns affect Napoleon's strategy in Russia? On February 24, 1812, Napoleon ordered his troops to prepare for the invasion, and by June 1812, his army was amassed on the Russian border, with 95,000 troops in the First Corps, led by Marshal Louis Nicolas Davout, and 72,000 troops in the Second Corps, led by Marshal Nicolas Charles Oudinot. As the invasion began, Napoleon's army advanced rapidly, covering 120 miles in the first week, and by July 1812, they had reached the city of Vilnius, which they captured on June 24, 1812, but the Russians had already begun to implement their scorched earth strategy, burning crops and destroying infrastructure, which would eventually leave Napoleon's army without food or shelter. And on July 23, 1812, the Russians launched a surprise attack on the French army at the Battle of Ostrovno, which, although repelled, gave the Russians valuable intelligence on French troop movements. The Battle of Smolensk, which took place on August 17, 1812, was a decisive French victory, but it came at a cost of 20,000 casualties, and as the French army continued to advance, they were met with increasing resistance, and on September 7, 1812, they fought the bloody Battle of Borodino, which resulted in 70,000 casualties on both sides, and left the French army weakened and demoralized. And you might ask, what would have happened if Napoleon had chosen to retreat after Borodino, rather than continuing to push on towards Moscow? The French army eventually captured Moscow on September 14, 1812, but the city was largely abandoned and burning, and the Russians had already removed or destroyed most of the supplies, leaving the French army to face the harsh Russian winter with limited resources, and on October 19, 1812, Napoleon ordered his army to begin their retreat, which would become one of the most infamous in history. As the French army retreated, they were met with increasingly harsh weather conditions, including temperatures as low as -20°C, and on November 26, 1812, they were forced to cross the frozen Berezina River, which resulted in the loss of thousands of men, and by December 1812, the French army had been reduced to just 93,000 men, with many of the survivors suffering from frostbite, starvation, and disease. And you might wonder, how did the French army's logistical failures contribute to their catastrophic defeat? The failure to supply the army with adequate food and shelter, combined with the Russian scorched earth strategy, had left the French army vulnerable to the harsh Russian winter, and by the time they retreated back to France, they had lost over 580,000 men, and the Russian army had emerged victorious, having successfully defended their territory, and on December 14, 1812, Napoleon arrived back in Paris, his reputation and power greatly diminished. The defeat in Russia marked a significant turning point in Napoleon's career, and in the years that followed, he would face increasing opposition from his own generals and the European coalition, and on April 6, 1814, he was forced to abdicate the throne, and exiled to the island of Elba, and the Congress of Vienna, which took place from September 1814 to June 1815, would go on to reorganize Europe, and establish a new balance of power, with Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria emerging as the dominant powers. And you might ask, what would have happened if Napoleon had been able to maintain his power and influence after the Russian campaign? The consequences of his defeat were far-reaching, and would shape the course of European history for centuries to come. As you reflect on the events that led to Napoleon's downfall, consider this: what can we learn from the catastrophic mistakes of the past, and how can we apply those lessons to our own lives, as we navigate the complexities and challenges of our own world? And what would you do differently, if you were in Napoleon's shoes, faced with the same decisions and uncertainties?